Supposedly there is a witch who is bewitching the people in the audience. You see the sort of spectral presence there shooting out from that person. But of course, the Salem witch trials are one of the things that we're going to talk about today, because they're really inextricable from New England Puritanism. We're also going to be talking about King Philip's War and about the captivity narrative of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, things that were briefly mentioned in the John Green video that I showed you last Thursday. So first, to give you some comparison and contrast between the Chesapeake and New England. I talked to you about how the Chesapeake was organized around plantations, about how the sex ratio was very skewed, 6 men to every 1 woman. So demographically, it took a long time for the Chesapeake to kind of get started in terms of population growth. But New England was completely different. The Puritan migration started in 1629 and lasted up and through the 1640s. But even after the Restoration had happened in 1660 in Britain, there was enough of a population in New England for growth to happen. By 1660, the population of New England was about 33,000 people. About half a century later, it had increased to 115,000 people. So a nice, healthy population growth. Why did this happen? Well, New England's migrants consisted of well-organized family units with age ratios close to normal and sex ratios not as badly skewed as had been the case in the Upper South. And as I said to you last week, people in New England could live to their 70s and 80s as long as they made it out of childhood. And so this meant there were a lot more older people in the community. And that was combined with a kind of reverence for old people, especially men. And also, part of this reverence was property-based, because if you were a younger person, you really couldn't inherit property until your father passed away. So you could be a man in his 40s or 50s, not really having property of your own because your father was still alive. So a deep respect for authority, very patriarchal community. Each house was like a little commonwealth, with the father most definitely being in charge. Children did not actually sit and eat at the table with their parents. They stood. In the presence of their parents, they needed to bow, they needed to remove their hats. So a real kind of reverence taken from, I guess, the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. There was the idea in New England of the covenanted family. This was so important in Puritan New England that you couldn't be a person without a family to belong to. If you found yourself in New England as a single person, you were like joined up with another family so that you would be under the supervision of a Puritan father figure. Now, the Puritans lived in villages. Their settlement was regulated, so they had a church that was normally at the center of their villages. They had a town common where some animals would graze. The houses were located all around the village green, And the farms were kind of the next ring outward. And what this means is that people could really see each other. They could see each other and they could monitor each other's behavior. Okay. They practiced subsistence agriculture rather than growing tobacco or some cash crop. So in a way, this was healthier. Remember I said that, and you guys know from having looked at the primary source from last week, the indentured servant in Virginia talking about how she didn't have enough food. Things were different in New England. There was enough to eat. People were producing food for their own families. Okay, any questions before I move on?
Yeah, but they further helped other families?
Yeah, these were fairly tight-knit communities that worked together. It was not a sort of boomtown atmosphere like it was in the Chesapeake, but this didn't mean that there were no conflicts among members of the community, and that's going to come up really when we look at the Salem witch trials. Yeah.
What is subsistence farming again?
It's farming just to support the family. They did not at first have a large surplus of goods to be able to ship, but what they did do was to become important commercial shippers for other goods. And the commercial ports of the Northeast were very important ports, ports like Boston, and then later New York. Many New England fortunes were made in the slave trade, and we're also going to see that many New England fortunes were made in the trade with China later on, like in the 19th century. Okay. Other questions? Okay, the most important thing, though, about New England was their religion. And I'm talking now about the Puritans rather than the separatists who I talked about, who had come from southern New England via Leiden because they didn't want to have anything to do with anybody else. They remained a pretty small presence in New England around Plymouth Plantation. But the Puritans were a large migration, and they were people who really believed that the Catholic Church had it wrong, and that the Church of England was too much like the Catholic Church. So they wanted to continue the Protestant Reformation. What was it about religion that bothered them, or was it about the Church of England that they didn't like? Well, first of all, they didn't like hierarchies. So the Church of England continued to have bishops and archbishops, and of course the king was at the head of the church. And the Puritans, who were Protestant, believed that there shouldn't be any mediating power between an individual and God. That everybody should be able to read the Bible, and everybody should make their own religious sort of decisions and determinations based on the Bible itself. They didn't like the idea of church courts for moral discipline. They confined worship to basically preaching and baptism and communion. But they saw communion as a kind of symbolic act rather than an actual transformation of the little host wafer into the body of Christ and the wine into the blood of Christ. Catholics believed in this time period that, you said a prayer over the host and it was really transformed, and Protestants didn't believe that. Puritans also wanted to build really unadorned meeting houses. They didn't like the way that in the Church of England, basically the Catholic churches had been somewhat stripped of their decoration, but not all the way. There were still stained glass windows, there was still incense and music, and none of this was acceptable to the Puritans. They also believed that the Church of Rome made everything too easy, that you just had to follow the outward forms, and that this made corruption possible. One of the reasons why Martin Luther had broken away from the Catholic Church was over the selling of indulgences. These were kind of like get out of jail free card. Catholics believed that you'd go to purgatory after you died, and then after a certain amount of time in purgatory with people praying for you, and your sins would kind of be forgiven, and then you'd go on to heaven. But the church at the time that Luther wrote his 95 Theses and nailed them to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral was selling what were called plenary indulgences, so they would just forgive all your sins in return for a certain amount of money. So the Puritans didn't like any of this. But the most important thing to remember about Puritans is predestination. Does anybody know what predestination means?
Like your fate is predetermined when you're born. You just kind of have one road to go, and that's it.
Right. So, and for some reason, I can't bring up the chat box right now, people on Zoom. So if you have any thoughts in terms of participating, just say it out instead of typing in the chat. Yes, they believed that there were only a certain number of saints and that God had predestined those people to go to heaven, and that nothing that they did could change that. So what is the problem, ideologically speaking, with predestination? Nobody has any thoughts about that? Is there some reason that you should do good works if you're predestined to go to either heaven or hell? Maybe not. Predestination did not give people, theoretically did not give people a good motivation for changing their behavior. But in fact, that was not how the Puritans responded to the idea of predestination. Instead, they obsessed about it. They obsessed about wanting to ensure that they were one of the godly elect.
So would they like try to do the most they could to?
No, they just would try to get the message. So here's how you got the message. You read your Bible, you prayed incessantly, you kind of meditated over the Word of God. And if you were a member of the godly elect, there would be some event that would happen. Like a streak of light would shine down through your window and land on your open Bible and illuminate a Bible verse that showed that you were, in fact, one of the saved, one of the elect.
But was that going on the idea that there was also witnesses to it?
Mm-hmm.
So everybody was
Yeah, after you had your conversion experience, you had to go before the church members, the other people who had already experienced this and were already among the godly, and you had to describe what had happened to you, and if it made sense to them, they would let you into the church. You would become a member of the church. But here's the thing. Truthfully, that happens to very few people. And so over time, there were fewer and fewer people coming forward and saying, I'm a member of the elect, I had this godly experience. So in 1676, the Puritans had to come up with another way to let people into the church called the halfway covenant, so that children of current church members were kind of halfway members when they were born. And that would kind of introduce them to the idea that they were also probably members of the elect, and make it so that the church didn't lose all of its members over time. Only after you had a conversion experience were you entitled to be baptized and marry in the church. The emphasis on predestination explains why Puritans spent so much time listening to sermons. They needed to hear explanations of the faith so that they could have like an alleviation of their terrible existential despair. Because you couldn't know, unless you had that conversion experience, that you were a member of the elect. So this church of true believers and voluntary saints was meant to be kind of an example to others. This is what John Winthrop meant by a city on a hill. With the halfway covenant, though, the Puritans introduced child baptism. Okay. Another thing to know about the Puritans is that even though they were extremely biblical in their religion, they thought that there were all kinds of supernatural forces at work. Like, they definitely believed that there was a devil incarnate who could take various different forms. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Witch, I think it was called. It's about these Puritans who are kind of living on the edge of society, and one of their goats is like possessed. That would be a thing that they would really believe. They believed also that God would work signs and wonders as a way of showing his power. So, for example, if a rainbow happened, God was trying to give a message. If there were weird weather, that was a message. If a child was born with a birth defect, that was because the parents had sinned in some way. Either they had had sex before they were married, or they had conceived that child on a Sunday, which was not a day when you were supposed to do that. So the sins of the parents could be expressed in the appearance of the child.
So was like these sermons, were they part of their everyday, like was it part of their everyday routine, or was it set aside for one day?
Well, basically Sunday, they spent the whole entire day in church. It was like an 8-hour day. You sat there for the whole day on a hard bench. Everybody who was over 6 weeks of age was expected to be there. And women, as soon as they emerged from confinement with their 6-week-old and up babies, were supposed to be there. If you should happen to fall asleep, there was a man with a sort of a doorknob on a long stick whose job it was to clobber you on the shoulder to wake you up. So this was for your benefit. And that's why people sat there. Okay, so the inability to know whether or not you were saved made people behave in strange ways with regard to supernatural beings. People sometimes did think that they had entered into pacts with the devil, or, did actually think witches were a thing. Because there was a lot of pressure put on them psychologically by their religion. And another thing that they displayed was a real lack of religious toleration for others. So, for example, they expelled all who disagreed with them. John Green mentioned Roger Williams. He thought that any religion ought to be tolerated. He got kicked out and sent to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was established as a colony that welcomed any believers. So the first Jews in American history ended up creating a temple in Providence, Rhode Island, I believe. Mary Dyer, a Quaker, dared to preach to the men and women of the Puritan community. And she got expelled from New England a couple of times, came back twice, and eventually was executed for her refusal to follow the directions of the Puritan ministers. Her mentor, Anne Hutchinson, who also dared to preach to both men and women, was banished to New York. The thing about Dyer and Hutchinson, they were both midwives, and one of them, on at least one occasion, had what was called a monstrous birth. Gave birth to a child that didn't survive, that had some kind of birth defect that was incompatible with life. And so the Puritans looked at her, I don't remember now whether it was Dyer or Hutchinson, but looked at her as though somebody was truly a sinner there to have that happen. Well, if you are going to have your whole religion kind of circle around the Bible, everybody needs to learn how to read. And so literacy was a key element of New England culture in a way that it never was in the Chesapeake. In 1647, the colony of Massachusetts required that towns with 50 families or more establish a school. That would be an elementary school. And then if a town or city had 100 families, they would need to establish a preparatory school so that students could learn the Greek and Latin that they needed to go on to become Puritan ministers. Harvard existed in the 1600s, and that was where the children, the young men who completed secondary school would go on to tertiary education. 60% of New England households owned at least one book. So that is a very large percentage compared to the rest of British North America. If they had one book, it was definitely going to be the Bible, which Puritans understood knew backwards and forwards. Children were taught to read by memorizing the Bible at a young age. So whenever something happened in their lives, Puritans would kind of have the Bible to latch onto as an explanation of what was going on. In addition to reading the Bible and other religious books, people engaged in a process of reading in which books were understood as the truth, rehearsed, memorized. Critical reading and reflection were unusual. Texts, rather, were the authority for your own self-examination to take place. They read a lot of books about conduct, books about prayer, but also books of astrology and weird tales and signs and wonders and monsters, and captivity narratives. Captivity narratives became a genre of book in New England that was very popular and was homegrown, because these were narratives of people who had been taken captive in wartime by indigenous people. And then, the reason they took them was mainly to ransom them for money. But when they were reunited with their families, this is when they would write a narrative of their time of captivity. So King Philip's War started in 1675. It was a war that started between the Wampanoag Indians, led by Metacom or King Philip, and the Puritan settlers. Three Wampanoags were executed for doing something wrong. And then the Wampanoag and the local Narragansett tribe got together about forming a defensive military alliance. That was enough for the English to attack them, and war broke out. The war lasted from 1675 to 1676. And the Native Americans were very successful at first. They managed to push the settlers out of all of their western possessions in Massachusetts, pushing them within 20 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Ultimately, though, the Native American offensive kind of settled down because the Native Americans had lost more people. They lost about 4,000 lives to 2,000 English. And Metacom, or King Philip, was himself beheaded in the autumn of 1676. In 1682, Mary Rowlandson, who had been captured and been held captive during King Philip's War, wrote really the first bestseller written in North America. What was called the true narrative of her captivity related what happened to her. She was a minister's wife, so she was a fairly high status individual. And she lived in Western Massachusetts along with some other people right along the frontier. And one day, Native Americans came to the village. They were not expecting an attack. I mean, the British North Americans were not expecting to be attacked. It was a very effective attack. A lot of the men were killed. Two of Mary Rowlandson's children were taken captive separately from her. And she was taken captive along with her mortally wounded 6-year-old daughter. Then she was dragged around for almost a year by the Native Americans as they moved through their wartime, movements, and they were bringing her to keep her for ransom. Her daughter died after only a few days on the road. The Native Americans kind of laughed at her when she asked for her daughter to be buried in a way so that the corpse wouldn't be eaten by animals. Basically, though, over time, she became incorporated into Native American life kind of as a servant. She was attached to one particular couple who were in charge of feeding her and giving her teepee space sometimes. She was given food to eat in return for doing things for the Native Americans. Because she was a Puritan woman, when she was taken captive, she had her sewing supplies on her body. Women kept their sewing supplies in what was called a pocket, which was like a little purse on the outside of their clothes. And she was able to sew, to use her sewing skills to barter that for food, and ultimately got given a Bible. And as she describes her captivity, the Bible was extremely important to her because it provided her with an explanation of what was going on. And her story of her trials and redemption kind of stood in for New England as a whole. Like every time the Native Americans did something smart, she thought it was God testing her. She tried to figure out what it was that God was punishing her for. Was it because she sometimes smoked a pipe on the Sabbath? Was it because she gossiped? I mean, she was always looking for the thing. Finally, she settled on God chasteneth those whom he loveth. So, in fact, he was chastening her because she was good, not because she was bad. She kind of couldn't wrap her mind around the fact that the Native Americans were better at fighting than the English were sometimes. She would say stuff like, isn't it amazing that the heathens, the savages, were able to cross the river with a bunch of women and children in tow, but then when it came to the English crossing after them, they were unable to do so. So not really a critique, but sort of a critique. Ultimately, she was ransomed for money. She wrote her narrative, which is very heavily interlarded with biblical references. And one of the things I think that is the most interesting about it is towards the very end, she says, at night when every eye is asleep but mine, I'm still awake. So I think she kind of had post-traumatic stress from her experience in captivity. Anyway, her narrative was very popular, it sold a lot of copies, and many Puritans identified with it because they thought the rough times they were experiencing were basically God chastening them because he loved them. So, I'm gonna pause for a sec. Any questions? Any questions at home? I'm looking at the chat right now. All right, back to the story. Oh, the other thing that I should have said on the previous slide, but for some reason I didn't, is that Puritans replaced a lot of the Catholic ways of celebrating during the year, a lot of the saints' days and fairs and festivals, with their own sort of rituals. They put a lot of energy into executions. If somebody was found to be guilty of a crime, executions were kind of like a party atmosphere. People would come out and sell food, and there would be last dying speeches, and everybody was supposed to watch the execution because it gave you a good moral lesson. So also funerals were a big kind of thing in Puritan life. There are stories of people getting immensely drunk at funerals and falling into freshly dug graves. So they like to party at funerals and executions. But otherwise, they were not big into celebrations, except for that weekly prayer meeting lasting all day, like I said. Okay. This brings us to the First Great Awakening. Now, in America, on a regular basis, there are these waves of religious enthusiasm that have come to be known the fill-in-the-blank Great Awakening. In this class, we're going to cover the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. They're substantially different in terms of their theological content, but what they both share is a renewed interest and enthusiasm about religion. The lack of a single state church made it very hard for people to get super bored with religion the way would ultimately happen in England, where there's a state church but hardly anybody goes. Americans are some of the most publicly religious people on the planet, in contrast. Okay, so in the First Great Awakening, here's what happened. There were these people, the old lights, old traditional Calvinist preachers who were not too concerned about getting people emotionally involved in their sermons, because what was the point? If you only had a certain number of people who were the elect, then getting people all supercharged about sinfulness or redemption was kind of pointless. In contrast, a group called the New Lights, including the Puritan divine Jonathan Edwards, were very much into really exploring the emotional content of religion, getting people excited or scared about what was going to happen to them. The reason that they kind of had to do this is, well, I mean, to a certain extent, it was a younger generation of Puritan divine, but also they were experiencing some competition from other groups, other religious groups, like the Methodists, for example. The Methodists, Quakers, and Baptists all have in common that they don't believe in predestination. And they all emerged in America in the early 1700s. The Methodists were very into preaching to the poor and the disenfranchised. They did a lot of singing of hymns. They would have these things called love feasts, where they would just sort of platonically love on each other. The Quakers believed that everyone had an inner light that made them all spiritually equal. Could there be anything worse from the perspective of Puritans? Probably not. The Baptists believed in adult baptism. During the First Great Awakening, this sort of like conflict of all these emergent religious groups leads to even very religious people saying there should not be a state church. Because if there is, we're going to lose our religious freedom, our freedom to practice our Christianity our way. The Puritans believed in complete congregational freedom, so they didn't want any kind of overarching bureaucracy saying anything to them. And of course, the Methodists, Quakers, and Baptists, who were less powerful politically, didn't want any state, church telling them what to do. And you also had the emergence in the later 1700s of deists. That is, people who believed that God created the universe, but maybe didn't believe in the divinity of Christ, maybe saw it as more God the watchmaker, who had kind of designed the watch that was creation, set it going, and then kind of backed off. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He cut all of the miracles out of the New Testament with a little knife, and his Bible is on display at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. He basically wanted to keep in the New Testament the teachings of Jesus, but without the miracle parts, which he thought didn't happen. Benjamin Franklin was also a famous deist, although there's a story about him getting really wrapped up in some Methodist preaching by George Whitefield, who was one of the founders of the Methodist movement and touring the US at the time. Okay, so all of these contribute to a feeling that there should be a separation of church and state. The First Great Awakening lasted from about 1735 in the 1760s. Calvinists tried to sort of beat back the encroachment of the Enlightenment and all these different religious varieties, but they were unable to do so. But I should also emphasize the impact of preaching that focused mainly on emotion rather than learning, because it kind of democratized religion. So even the Calvinists, like Jonathan Edwards, were emphasizing emotion. His famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, talks about people kind of being like spiders over the flames of hell, just held up by a tiny piece of spider web and about to drop into the flames at any point. He was a very charismatic preacher. Okay, questions? Any questions about this?
I have a question.
Sure.
So the New Lights are the Methodist, Quakers, Baptists?
No, the New Lights were good question. The New Lights were the younger generation of Calvinists who were trying to appeal more to the emotions because of the encroachment by non-Calvinist groups. So the Methodists, Quakers, and Baptists, all non-Calvinist, all not believing in predestination. The New Light Calvinists or New Light Puritans did believe in predestination, but they were trying to get an audience. So they were more emotive in their expressions. Good question. Other questions? Zoom people, you're so quiet. Yeah, go on.
Is there any explanation as to how they actually got people to, like, I understand that they were preaching about, like, the emotional side, but was that really it? Is that what it took to, because I can see from the perspective of the old lights, like, yeah, like, if it's a limited number of people, then why continue to try? Do the new lights have any promises of something, or were they really just that good at provoking people to react?
Well, I think they were better at provoking people to react, and what you see is a lot of congregational infighting in New England as people begin to choose which preacher they will go see. Even people who have been Calvinists their entire lives start to do some church shopping. It does not solve the problem of, the official word is Arminianism, the problem of what to do when other religions say, or other kinds of Christianity say, everybody can be saved if you do X and Y. It doesn't really address that at all, but it did kind of pull some of the interest towards younger preachers and newer churches. Other questions? All right, so now I'm going to say a few words about other colonies. The Middle Atlantic states are the states basically north of Delaware and south of New England. So I'm really talking about New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. New York was settled by the Dutch. Remember I told you that in the 1600s, the Dutch and the English were pretty constantly at war with each other. They actually fought 4 wars over the course of the 17th century. In 1664,
Was it over dispute of land, or was it?
no, it was basically over trade routes. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602. The British East India Company was founded in 1603. And both of them were sending ships to what is now Indonesia, basically, to get spices. So that started off a trade war among or between Britain and the Netherlands that kind of festered all throughout the 1600s. And one aspect of this was whenever a war was fought, each was trying to pick off land controlled by the other side. So in 1664, during one of these wars, New Netherland, which was settled by the Dutch, was captured by the English. It was renamed after the Duke of York, who was Charles II of England's younger brother, James. So that's why it was called New York. It was a very polyglot place because the Dutch had begun to import a lot of African servants, and New York became really a center of the use of enslaved people for labor. And this kind of lasted right up until the Civil War. That New York was kind of a pro-slavery town in the middle of sort of usually not enslaving people north. There was a concept of half freedom that people who were enslaved could aspire to, where they would have some rights, but for the most part, you know, they were still enslaved. New York remained a very cosmopolitan place. It became the major port on the East Coast of what would later be the United States. And it still contained large groups of Dutch landlords, especially in the Hudson Valley. if you drive through the Hudson Valley today, you'll see, you know, a lot of Dutch names for places due to this. Okay, so New York was captured by the English from the Dutch. New Jersey, in contrast, was a proprietary colony. The Duke of York, the guy that I mentioned a moment ago, gave New Jersey to two of his underlings and said, okay, here's a bunch of territory for you. So in this way, it was kind of similar to what happened in Maryland, where a large grant of land was given to a friend of the king. However, there were already a bunch of Quakers living in New Jersey, and they really didn't want to bow to the guys that were put in charge of New Jersey by the Duke of York. And so eventually they decided to secede, and New Jersey had two halves, West Jersey, which was the Quaker half, and East Jersey, which was the closer to New York and actually the proprietary colony half. And then next to West Jersey, we have Pennsylvania, which was given to the Quakers by Charles II. William Penn, who was a Quaker leader, was the recipient of this property. And then in 1682, he bought some more property in what is today Delaware. And Penn launched a holy experiment in Pennsylvania, giving everyone who settled there liberty of conscience, the right to vote, and due process of law. Now, as I said to you before, you know, the Quakers believed everybody had an inner light, that everybody was on a spiritual plane in terms of equality. So it makes sense that the Quakers believed this. But it also meant that because they were offering religious freedom, lots of people who were persecuted in their home countries ended up coming to Pennsylvania in the 1700s to seek a place where they could practice freely. In case you're wondering why the Amish and the Mennonites ended up in Pennsylvania, that's why. It was because the Quakers said anybody can practice here. The Quakers got in trouble a lot because they refused to bow to others, they refused to curtsy, they refused to remove their hats, do what was called hat honor, by tipping the hat to people. They referred to everyone as friend, and they also used the pronouns thee and thou for other people, which may sound like they're real formal, but in fact, those were the sort of, if you know Spanish, it was like calling everybody tú in the 1700s. So Quakers were often getting in trouble for not being sufficiently deferential. Questions?
Was there any reason behind the thee and thou, like for them calling people that?
Well, they had decided that everybody was spiritually humble and equal. And so they were, it's kind of like when the French called everybody, whatever they all called each other during the French Revolution, citizen. And the Russians all called everybody comrade during the Russian Revolution. It was just a way to show that everybody was equal and humble. Good question. Other questions? All right, and then finally we have the southern colonies. Now, Carolina started off as one colony. Only later will it become North and South Carolina. And Carolina was a stomping ground for, was attractive to English colonists from the Caribbean, who were looking for someplace else to settle. Anthony Ashley Cooper, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, started to bring in a lot of English colonists from the Caribbean to settle at Charlestown. He set up a structure of government there, including an aristocracy. Only those who owned large tracts of land could be part of the Council of Nobles, and the government became very stratified. It attracted lots of immigrants from Barbados, and ultimately the Carolinas will become the place with the largest proportion of enslaved people, the largest ratio of enslaved people to slave owners. As we're going to see, South Carolina in particular is also a hotbed of secessionist sentiment later on, and will become the first state to secede in the run-up to the Civil War. South of the Carolinas, Georgia was started as a penal colony. You needed to, if you didn't have jails, and Britain in this time period really didn't have good jails or prisons, or enough of them, the way that you could deal with your criminals was by transporting them to some other part of the world. And so criminals were transported to Georgia as a buffer zone between English colonies and Spanish colonies in North America. So the people who started off going to Georgia were criminals. Later, other poor people migrated to Georgia. It was kind of like, it was being advertised a little bit as a sort of white man's paradise. But James Oglethorpe, who started the penal colony there, did not want slavery because he thought that it would impair the willingness of the white people working there, the poor farmers and former criminals, to actually do work. Well, it's not going to surprise you to hear that within a few years, the inhabitants of Georgia kind of caught the spirit of, why should we actually do our own work when we could get African enslaved people to do it for us? And Georgia had to back off on that and became as much of a slave society as any place else in the South. Ultimately, when the United States declares itself an independent nation and breaks away, the British have to look somewhere else for a penal colony for their criminals. Anybody know where they go next?
Australia.
That's right. They started off with Australia, what will later be Australia, as a penal colony. So